Previously. Alright, so we're done. This is the end of an era. I've gone over all 4 games in the series. You know, this is kind of sad, honestly. I don't know the next time I'll make more Mystery Dungeon content. Also, previously.
There was also the Japan-only WiiWare titles, which exist, and no one really talks about.
Oh yeah. Those games do exist, don't they? Well, given that my previous Mystery Dungeon content has done so well, why not give these games a whirl? Roll intro! The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series has always been associated with Nintendo's handheld systems, most notably the DS and 3DS systems. For most, the games made the jump to home consoles in March of 2020, with the release of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX on the Nintendo Switch. However, that attribution would be incorrect, because on August 4th, 2009, 3 titles in the series were released on the Wii Shop channel in Japan, and unfortunately, that was it for the longest time. The titles were never released in North America for reasons that are ultimately unknown, and thus they were largely forgotten. That was until April of last year, when they were finally translated into English by a group of fans who had been working on the project for years. And with that, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Keep Going, Wildfire Adventure Squad, Let's Go, Tempest Adventure Squad, and Go For It, Radiant Adventure Squad were now available to an international audience for the first time. And because of that, I think I owe it to you guys to correct my previous mistake of ignoring these titles and sort of explain what these games' whole deal is. Aesthetically, these games are a bit of an odd one out. Predating Gates to Infinity by 3 years, these games were actually the first ones to make the jump to 3D, and in doing so made some interesting decisions. Instead of using some more normally proportioned models like were used in some other Pokemon games like Pokemon Battle Revolution, these games opted to use the same models that were used in the games Pokemon Rumble and My Pokemon Ranch, which, due to the fact that the latter of these games allowed the player to use their Miis in-game, resulted in the Pokemon being modeled in a way to match that art style. For me, I find the Mii art style to be a little off-putting, and was never a big fan of it, but that's whatever. It's a really minor decision that doesn't really affect the game all that much. In fact, in some ways, it helps to emphasize the game's more laid-back nature when compared to some other Mystery Dungeon titles. More on that in a second. However, despite this really strange art style choice, I'd say that these games look pretty good, all things considered. The 3D models actually look pretty nice when played on the Dolphin emulator, and the UI and text don't look that bad when scaled up from their original resolution. There were times that I legitimately forgot that these games were released on a system that was only capable of 480 resolution. Musically, this game doesn't have any major standout tracks, but there are still some pretty good tunes in there. Of course, all the classics that we've come to expect are back, like the Monster House theme and Defy the Legends, but the original themes aren't that bad either. 2 standouts to me are the theme of the main Hubtown area and Path to Treasure Island, just to name a few. However, that's not the real reason that I find these games interesting. What makes them fairly interesting to talk about is the gameplay of this trio. On a fundamental level, these games play pretty much identically to Explorers of Sky, which unfortunately means that some of the weaker elements of that game make a return, such as the IQ system, which is an extremely tedious system to max out. And its inclusion here really highlights how much better features like looplets and rare qualities really are in comparison. However, these games do add their own unique wrinkles to the formula. One is the fact that Pokemon can now evolve in the middle of a dungeon, something that isn't possible in any other entry besides Gates to Infinity. Other major change is the introduction of the Pokemon stack mechanic. Essentially, when the player passes over one of these holes in the ground, they're able to stack multiple Pokemon on top of each other, which allows for multiple moves to be strung together against a single target, while only consuming the PP of the Pokemon on the bottom of the stack. However, this system also comes with the unique disadvantage of the stacked Pokemon not being able to recover HP naturally during exploration, meaning that the player is more vulnerable than usual when using this feature. Arguably, this is definitely one of the most unique systems that these games have introduced, although it sometimes feels like the game is built around it a little too much, to the point where it becomes the dominant strategy for pretty much all dungeon runs. The other major innovation is the fact that save data is shared between all 3 games, This means things like items and recruited Pokemon are shared between the titles, and the player can go into any one of them and access a Pokemon or item that they obtained in another. This includes bringing in a way over-leveled Pokemon and breezing through dungeons like they're practically nothing. Obviously, the main advantage of this is the fact that all 3 games have completely unique dungeons and Pokemon lists. So, in order to see and do everything, the game needs to be completed a total of 3 times across each version, and it's easier when that data is shared between playthroughs. That requirement, however, exposes a bit of a minor annoyance with the games. Namely that tutorials are repeated when starting a new playthrough on a different game, with no real option to skip them. This is a minor grievance, I'll admit, but it's still something that the games could have done without in order to improve the experience just a little bit. One quality of life improvement that these games do have over Explorers is the fact that it will warn the player if they try to go out in a dungeon without accepting a mission first. I know that when I went back to replay Explorers of Sky recently, I found that having to accept a mission before going out to be really annoying, and I sometimes would just completely forget and be forced to reset to my last save to make up for that mistake. So having that warning definitely helps. Thankfully, later entries did do away with this by opting to have missions be accepted by default once they're selected from the board, which is honestly how it should have been the entire time. And the fact that it was different from that is just a really weird design decision, if you ask me. In terms of controls, there are several different options, including the Wiimote, the GameCube controller, and the Nintendo DS system itself, which is kind of just a cool feature, and it's a nice callback to the fact that other games were on the DS at the time. Unfortunately, some features are completely inaccessible now, due to the fact that the Wi-Fi services for the Wii have since been shut down. The player is unable to request a rescue from a friend, and the ability to download special missions is completely missing due to this limitation. Moving on to the story, this is definitely a point for these games that is the weakest. Get ready, because I'm about to explain the entire plot to you right now. One day, a Pokemon named Shuckle goes missing, and his friends, Aron and Swinub, go to the town elder Slowking for help, at which point the player's group offers to help. They rescue Shuckle from a dungeon, who then reveals that he went out to find a tasty treat, only to get lost in the process. From there, Slowking has the player's group form an adventure squad, and starts having them accept missions. After a few days, the group learns of a dungeon that is supposed to contain the most amazing snack. They go and bring back this chocolate, which eventually leads to a feud and all the Pokemon getting mad at each other. Following that, Slowking asks the group to travel to another dungeon in order to find a treasure that will hopefully set things right. They do that, and this time return with special friendship cookies, which cause all the Pokemon to get along again. The end. No, I'm serious. That's the entire plot of all 3 games. Yeah, it's not super amazing. And compared to other Mystery Dungeon games, it's severely lacking in terms of both character and, just being interesting. The characters are just so generic, and the playable cast has literally no personality to speak of. And the overall narrative is just so childish, it feels like it's straight out of a children's storybook instead of a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. To give you an idea, it's the only title in the series for me to not elicit any kind of emotional reaction at the end. And that's pretty significant considering what series we're talking about here. That being said, there are a few things to note here from this. The first is that this is the first and only game where the player isn't a human that transformed into a Pokemon, and also beats out Gates to Infinity as the first game to drop the personality quiz in favor of letting the player choose their starter. In this particular case, the player also gains access to all of the other starter Pokemon right after completing the first dungeon run, instead of being constrained to the 2 they chose like in all other games. Both of these are a bit of an odd choice, but I think it kinda works in the game's favor given that it's not trying to go for any type of epic, grandiose story. So to remove the human that gets transformed into a Pokemon aspect, thus removing a lot of the mystery that pervades the plot of other games, it does help in achieving those aims. I also do kinda like getting a more diverse set of Pokemon to pick from the start, even if a good chunk of each game's starter Pokemon are all the same type. The main advantage is that it allows you to set your party for the entire adventure at the start, and doesn't force you to wait until the end to get the ones that you didn't pick. It does also remove a bit of the gravity of the starter choice, but again, without the story, the player-partner dynamic isn't that big of a deal, and most of them are the same type anyways, so why does it matter? I will say though, the lack of a story does a lot to sort of maybe expose some of the issues with the gameplay that the series often gets criticized for, because when that's the only thing you're playing the game for, and you're not doing it just to find out what happens next, I find that you kind of burn out from the more repetitive dungeon crawly elements a lot more quickly. Especially when the dungeons start throwing in more random bullshit at you as you go on. This isn't to say that the other games deserve the low scores that they tend to get. Far, far from it. Just that the story is kind of an important part of what makes Mystery Dungeon, well, Mystery Dungeon. So overall, what are my thoughts on these games? I think that they're okay, but they are by far the black sheep of the series, even more so than Gates to Infinity. There's definitely a game here, but there just isn't that much to chew on, honestly, and you'd be better off playing one of the other games in the series instead if you have to pick one. There are some interesting ideas here, don't get me wrong, but the overall amount of content just isn't that impressive, especially considering that you have to retread old ground 3 times in order to see everything that these games have to offer. My final assessment is that these games exist, and that's really all I have to say about them. Play them if you really want to, but again, just play one of the other games. Like, you'll have a much better time if you do that.